Okay, I know we're all excited to begin, but Silas, before we get started, I wanted to say thank you for coming home to Laurel County, for joining us at the Laurel County Public Library for One Book, One Community. We are really, really excited to share with the community this book, Eli the Good, and to share our love for reading. And I'm going to go ahead and get started with our first question because I know we're ready to jump right in. So, Silas, there are two Elis in the story. There's 10-year-old Eli from 1976 and then grown-up narrator Eli. So, beyond their ages, how do the Elis differ from each other?
That's a good question. Well, I think, the child Eli is asking all the questions that I want the book to ask. And then the adult Eli has benefited from the answers that he's gained. Really, the book grew out of the question I have. Anytime that I can't understand something, I write a book about it. And I spend 4 or 5 years on that question, writing the book, and that helps me to answer it for myself. So it's sort of a long, complicated answer, but the thing is that, to me, this book is set in 1976, and it's about a family who, from the point of view of this little boy, has fallen apart over the course of one summer. But really, what I think the book's about, it's about the years following 9/11. And so the summer of 1976 is standing in for the years immediately after 9/11, when we as a country were so trying to figure ourselves out and try to come back, try to figure out how to go forward as a nation after, this huge event. And so Eli is just thinking especially about what it means to be a real patriot. And so right after 9/11, there were all these questions of patriotism and things like that. And personally, I was offended that people thought that patriotism was just putting your flag out or just putting a bumper sticker on your car. And I wanted to write a book that said, true patriotism is about being of service to your country. And sort of talking about the ways you can be of service. Not everybody can go into the military. When we talk about the military, we'll say they went into the service, right? But there are lots of ways to be of service. So everybody in the book is being of service. Eli's a 10-year-old boy is trying to figure out how he can be of service. So we can talk more about that as we go forward. I don't want to be too lengthy. I don't know how many questions are in there.
Very good.
On page 11, you wrote, "The trees," says Edie. "They talk to you if you listen hard enough." What are some things that Eli learns about himself over the course of the summer?
Well, he starts out thinking that he's responsible for everything that's happening. I think children always think that. When something bad happens in a child's family, the child thinks they are responsible for that they could have changed that if they had just done something differently, that things wouldn't have failed. And so by the end of the book, I think he figures out, that he's not responsible for his whole family. And he's also figured out how to be good. One thing that I really enjoyed about being on book tour with this book was I went to a lot of middle schools and even elementary schools, and I hadn't really had that experience as a writer because my books before this were all, for adults. But this book is sort of for all ages, for anybody. And I wrote it that way so that lots of different ages could read it. And when I went to schools, the smaller the children were, the more adamant they were with this question. The first thing they would ask me would be, "Why did you call Eli the Good? Because he's not good." Well, I was real surprised by that because I think he's very good. But he sort of breaks the cardinal rules of being a child from a child's point of view. He eavesdrops, he spies on people, he betrays his best friend. That's the ultimate, thing they can't forgive him for. He reads letters that don't belong to him. He's nosy and et cetera, et cetera. That's because he's a writer, and writers do all those things. And And so it gave me the opportunity to talk to those children about, I believe that the way you become good is by trying to be good. You're not just good or bad. You have to try to be good. And that makes you a better person. So I've gotten way away from the question, but...
In the book, Eli's father sends home 7 photographs, and these really reveal a lot about him and his experience with the war. What is it that it's revealing about him?
Well, it's revealing how horrible the war was, and it allows Eli to understand what a traumatic experience it was, and it allows him to understand the post-traumatic stress disorder that his father has. Although he doesn't have a name for that, they don't know what to call that. The only thing that's autobiographical about this book is that my father was a Vietnam veteran and had PTSD. We didn't name that or anything. The other thing that's really true is that the letters in the book are all my father's actual letters, and the photographs are actual photographs. So when I was growing up, I never read those letters until I was an adult. But I did look at those pictures all the time. I would sneak and look at them. And they're really graphic, horrible pictures, disturbing pictures. So it made me think a lot about the war. And the reason I did that is because my father would never talk about the war. He didn't want to talk about it, and he certainly didn't want to brag about it. And so that's another reason I wrote the book, is because in the years after 9/11, I felt like we were really gung-ho to send people to war, but then when they got back, we didn't treat them properly. They weren't being treated properly by the medical establishment. They weren't being treated properly for post-traumatic stress disorders. I mean, they were being sent for 3 and 4 tours of duty in a row. And so the book is somewhat speaking to that too, and talking about how if we're going to send people to fight our wars, then we need to treat them better when they return. That was something I saw a lot we all saw a lot after 9/11, in those 5 or 6 years.
Let's talk about flag pants for a second.
Yes.
Josie and her flag pants. Her pants are very important to her.
Mm-hmm.
What is the significance of the pants, and why does her mother hate them so bad?
Well, the person who wore those flag pants is actually here, the real person. Oh. My first cousin right here, Alicia, who's like my sister, she had a pair of pants that looked like the American flag. Yeah. And she wore them because she thought they were cool. Yeah. She wasn't making a political statement. But some people thought that it was, that when that fashion became in vogue, some people felt it was disrespectful to the flag and it was problematic and things like that, instead of just being the style.
Yeah.
And so I always loved this picture of her wearing these pants, and I thought they were so indicative of the era and really just took me back to the 1970s. And usually when I write, I'm thinking of images. I love movies, and so when I write a novel, I'm really seeing it as a movie, and I'm trying to write it in such a way that hopefully you see it as a movie too. So I'm hoping it's lots of images that you're seeing. And so I just thought that was a good image. I do think that in that time period, there was that generation gap. The phrase generation gap was something that we heard a lot in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, right? And even up to the 80s, into my childhood. And I thought that was a good way to talk about the generation gap, because Josie just thinks they're cool pants until she figures out they can press buttons.
Right. And
then she wears them even more for that reason. And so the answer is because her mother just saw them as disrespectful. And so I'm playing with those notions of what patriotism is and things like that.
Yeah.
To me, the whole book's about freedom, patriotism, friendship, being weird, being a child. Now, when I say freedom, I'm especially thinking of not only like freedom in that big, huge national way we think of it, but even freedom as a child has, as the child knows it. When I was writing Eli the Good, loved so much writing these scenes where children are riding all over on their bicycles and they're playing in the creek. And my children grew up in the same community I grew up in, but they didn't have near the freedom that I had because the world had changed in such a huge way. And many of you, probably grew up in Laurel County and then raised your children in Laurel County, but it was, even in, little Laurel County, it was a different world. And so I was thinking a lot about that, like, what is freedom and how we define that in different ways?
Though Eli won't admit it, Edie is his best friend. What qualities do they have that makes them kindred spirits?
Well, they're both really weird, and she claims her weirdness. She's all right. She doesn't care what anybody thinks, and he's still working on that. He's not as brave as she is. And he's not as strong as she is, and she has to be strong. She's, her family really is falling apart. And she's holding it together the best way she can, mostly by just being really strong and almost brutal in a way. She doesn't care to knock a boy out or whatever. She was very much based on my childhood best friend that grew up right across the road from me. Her name's Donna Conley. Some of you may remember her. And that was just the way Donna was. She could beat up any boy on our road, and she didn't take anything off anybody, and I always just really respected that about her. And she also was just totally always herself. In a time and a place when that wasn't a very acceptable thing to do, Now, when my daughters were in high school here, people were much freer to be individuals and be themselves in a way that we were expected to be much more uniform and alike,
In the book, Eli looks at his mother and he comments that it looks like she has Vietnam stamped across her forehead, or that's what he believes about her. How is that true for her? Obviously, Vietnam impacted his father, but how did it impact his mother as well?
Well, that's another thing the book's really about to me, is about the way that war affects everybody and how not only veterans, but veterans' families pay that price. And so I think that I was, trying to show that through her more than anybody. And I know the way that the war had an impact on my mother as the wife of a veteran, the way it still has an impact on her. The way the war not only changed my father's everything about him, but the way that it has shaped his body. And, it destroyed his feet and hurt his back, and he still has shrapnel in him. And so it's such a physical thing, and my mother helps to take care of that as well. So it just impacts everybody. So I wanted to write a book that was very much, I wanted it to be pro-soldier, but also I wanted it for people to think more about how gung-ho would they be to go to war if they were the ones having to go. I read somewhere just today that in 1917 they had this legislation on the books that the whole country, there had to be a national vote to go to war, but whoever voted yes had to put their name in the pot to go. So I think that would lessen our desire to go to war a lot more. And I just think there's always a problem area there. The people who seem to be the most gung-ho are often the ones who are taking the funding away from helping our veterans, and that really burns me up. Did I answer that question at all?
All right, at the beginning of the summer, Eli, when he thinks about himself and other children of Vietnam veterans, he thinks that they're caught between defending their fathers and not understanding them. Mm-hmm. How does he feel at the end of the summer, and what changes for him?
I don't know how much he's changed on that by the end of the summer, but by the end of the book, he's changed on it. I think that, one thing that always troubled me growing up was the way that, sorry, I have allergies starting up. was the way my father was treated when he came back from Vietnam, and the way that a lot of Vietnam soldiers were treated. Just this national reaction that was really messed up. And also that went far into my childhood, where I remember one time we were at a parade. It was at the Nibrock in Corbin. And this was like way up in the mid-'80s. And this is in the book. So they march up all these soldiers from World War II, soldiers from Korea, even maybe soldiers from World War I, but there were no Vietnam soldiers represented. And so still this idea that Vietnam shouldn't be acknowledged that way or something like that. And I think we've really evolved on that and changed on that in the last 25 years or so. But even when I was a child, that was still something that was really problematic in the way people thought about Vietnam. It was just such a divisive war. And so for me, when I became an adult and was somebody who just could not keep my mouth shut when I was upset by something, that was I can't think of the right word. It was hard for me because on one hand I wanted to speak up and I wanted to protest and I wanted to make my voice heard, but on the other hand, I remembered how a lot of protest had affected my father. So really, I keep saying things the book's about. Really what the book's about is if you're going to protest something, then make sure you're educated about it. Make sure that you know what you're talking about, and also make sure that you're doing it with as much respect as possible to everybody concerned. Because I believe strongly, probably more in this than more than anything, that we have a responsibility as Americans to speak up when something is not morally right, when our government is acting incorrectly. But at the same time, we have to do that with full respect, and we have to be fully educated and not just be spouting off whatever we heard somebody else say on Facebook or whatever. I tell everybody to read the news and not consume it on TV, for one thing, and not to just repeat what you hear in the break room. But so I was thinking about a lot of stuff with this little book.
Yeah.
Both Eli and his sister Josie resent their mother's deep devotion to their father. Are these hard feelings justified?
That was really what I was basing that on was when I was growing up, and Eli's about 6 years older than me, so I don't really remember 1976. I was only 5, but by the time I was a child in the 80s, one of the major things that people thought a lot about and talked a lot about was how common divorce was becoming. And so I often felt like that everybody I knew, their parents were getting a divorce except for my parents. And so my parents were like this really crazy over each other in love couple that were sort of the opposite of all my friends' parents, who were always, breaking up or should be breaking up because they were always fighting and violent and things like that. So I was using them as an example of that, as a couple who sort of staying together in the midst of the rest of that institution of marriage really changing, and the way people thought about divorce really changing, going from something that people were, scandalized by to something that people don't think that much about now. The other part of that is that he's a child, and so he's misunderstanding, right? He overhears his mother say, his mother and father are having this private moment, and she says, I love you more than anything. Well, we say stuff like that all the time, but he takes it very literally. And so I was trying to show the way a child can so easily misunderstand something and how that can lead to lots of ramifications.
And going off of talking about Eli's father, in the story, Eli says that he was unusually silent about everything, which is most likely why he stayed on the edge of explosion all the time. You talked about how your own father didn't really like talking about the war, and my grandfather was in Vietnam, and he never talked about it. That was a taboo subject. But is Eli right in saying that his silence kind of kept that explosion from happening?
I think for his father, yeah. And also I think that's pretty, I I think most Appalachian men, I don't mean to generalize or stereotype, but most country men that I know are that way. They're just not going to talk about their feelings that much. They're not going to expose that much of themselves. That's something that they just don't expose. And that can be dangerous. People do need to talk about stuff. And so on one hand, he's not talking so he won't explode, but on the other hand, his not talking leads to these big explosions, right? Because it just builds up and builds up. When I was writing the book, I did a lot of research on PTSD. I worked with the VA in Lexington, and I went to a VA therapist who, I interviewed at length and things like that. So one thing I learned is that post-traumatic stress disorder affects everybody differently, of course, and we sort of kind of lump it all into one thing. But something that is fairly common is that these moments of rage that build up, sort of explosions in that way, that can happen. And they manifest in lots of different ways. Some people are just, loud, and some people get violent, and some people just go off by themselves or whatever. Yeah.
You sort of talked about this a few minutes ago about Eli's eavesdropping. So his mother and his best friend both disapprove of his eavesdropping, and they know that he does it. Why does he keep doing it? And is this a character flaw? Is this what an aspiring writer needs to do? So do you care to talk about that for a second?
Well, yes to all that.
Yeah.
I mean, a character has to have some flaws, most of us don't really like saintly, perfect people, so you don't want your character to be too perfect, or they'll just become like mealy-mouthed and annoying, and so he does need to have some flaws, even though he's the protagonist. But also, the main thing is that's somewhat autobiographical. My whole part of that is me being a writer, and the other part of it is my culture. I grew up around storytelling people, and so, they would just tell these big stories, and sometimes they weren't things I should be hearing as a child, and they would say, you go on, go in the other room, or go to bed, or whatever. Well, I wouldn't. I would act like I did and come back and get the dirt, and all that stuff made me a better writer. Yeah. And even now, if I'm in a restaurant eating, I'll be eavesdropping. Like, I'll be talking, having a conversation with the people I'm with, but I'll also be watching the people behind them or listening to the booth behind me. A writer just has to sort of be like an animal in that way, like have an animal sort of hearing and heightened senses, because your whole job as a writer is to articulate what human beings are doing. So you have to be working all the time, and always have that antenna up.
Now we'll all be looking for you at restaurants.
Right. Yeah. I know when I say that, then afterwards people are real paranoid around me.
No, I'm teasing.
Everyone in Eli's family seems to have secrets. Which of the family's secrets are the easiest to understand, and which are the most damaging?
Well, I think, the hardest thing for them is that, and I'm giving away a lot of stuff for those of you who haven't read it, but I hope you read it anyway, is that Josie finds out that her daddy is not her father. And so that's real hard for her to deal with as a 16-year-old. And I put that in there. Lots of people ask me, why'd you do that? The main reason I did that is because I wanted to, that's symbolically to have the reader question history. And I have a whole chapter in there talking about the way that we're not taught our true history. I had great history teachers in Laurel County, but the textbooks that we read, they didn't give us a full picture of like the Native American genocide that happened, or the full picture of slavery, or our labor history, for instance, and things like that. And so I think often that we don't know enough of our own history as Americans. I taught in Ireland 3 or 4 years ago, and you would be in a cab in Ireland and the cab driver would tell you the whole history of Ireland, like in a really intricate way. And Americans, we can't do that. And that's a little bit scary, I think, because when you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it, right? We all know that. And so I wanted people to think about questioning your own history. Also, you want as many secrets going on in the book as possible. You know, the best thing I ever learned about writing, if there's any writers in the room, is that you put your characters in as much trouble as possible, and then you add another layer of trouble and another layer of trouble, and then you have an interesting book. Nobody wants to read about happy people who are just living calm lives, you know. You want to be with them while they're trying to obtain happiness, and as soon as they get happy, or there's the notion they might become happy, then you get out of there. You know, you end the book. Happy people are annoying too, you know.
Eli reads one of my favorite books in the story. He reads The Diary of Anne Frank, and if you've read it, you know it has a really tragic ending in that Anne dies. But for Eli, the ending makes him a little bit hopeful. Why does it make him so hopeful?
I think because Anne Frank, you know, she even though she was killed at a very young age, she lived out her dream. She wanted to be a writer, and she wanted to change the world, and I think she did. You know, I mean, she certainly changed me, and I think most people who've encountered her story have been changed by that, and it just makes you understand war and the Holocaust and hatred and all those things in a new way. And we'd be well served to revisit the story of Anne Frank right now while so much hatred is going on in the world. And I just always loved her story so much, and I thought it would be perfect to use the Diary of Anne Frank in this book because she's a child of war. So is Eli. You know, he's not having to hide out at the risk of being caught by soldiers, but he's still a child of war. The novel is also sort of a book of books. There's lots of books mentioned in it, and two of my favorite books in particular are mentioned in The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton and The Diary of Anne Frank. And also Centennial by John Michener's in there, if any of y'all remember that book. And a few others I can't think of right now. But one of my daughters was about 10 years old when I was writing, at some point when I was writing this book, and she was reading the Diary of Anne Frank, and I thought, that'd be perfect. And by the way, you know, if you're writing a book about a 10-year-old, it really pays off to have a 10-year-old in the house, because I look to them all the time for the way children really think and act and react and all those things. You know, there's several times in the book you're told that Eli's reaching up for something. Well, that doesn't serve any purpose really, except to, as the reader, psychologically, in the back of your mind, that makes you realize, oh, it reminds you, he's a child. Of course he's reaching up, he's small. You know, little psychological things like that to just put in. So having my daughters, you know, really made this book, I think, be true to life, of a child's life. It's the hardest thing, I think, is to write a child's point of view, especially because it's a combination, like you said, it's the adult Eli. He's thinking back, but when he thinks back, it has to be in that child's voice. The other book that does that I'm not comparing myself to, but another book that does that everybody knows is To Kill a Mockingbird. But when we think about To Kill a Mockingbird, we're thinking that it's a child, but it's actually the adult scout who's telling the story, but she puts you back in the child scout's point of view.
We're going to start moving away from Eli in just a second, but I have one more Eli question. Then we've got some other great questions and audience questions. So the epilogue carries the story of Eli and his family into present day. Mm-hmm. So how has the family members changed, and how have they not changed?
I don't think his parents have changed much. I don't know. I think the only people that have really changed is Eli, the only person. I think the rest of them always pretty much knew who they were. And I really like that about them. I like it when people know who they are, you know. I guess they all grow to understand each other and be more patient with each other and work together better and cooperate better. But really the book's about Eli figuring out who he is, as any coming-of-age book really is. That's, you know, the main thing it's about.
Is there anything that you edited out of the book? Any top secret scenes that you had in there that you decided to take out?
Well, the book now ends with 9/11, more or less. You're in that the year following 9/11, and then originally the book started with 9/11. There is a screenplay that's been written of the book that'll probably never become a movie because everyone they've ever written a screenplay hasn't become a movie, so I don't get my hopes up in any way. But in the movie, it actually starts with 9/11, and I about died when I read it because in the first scene, Edie is killed in 9/11. She's killed in the towers. I'm like, you know, my character that I created, somebody else kills her.
Oh, no.
You know, this screenwriter kills her. So that was difficult. But it works well in a film to give it that framing device. So in a way, I wish I had sort of kept that 9/11 beginning, but my editor and I finally decided it would be better for the reader to discover by the end of the book that it's about 9/11 instead of thinking that the whole way through.
Who are other authors, both classic and contemporary, that inspire you to be a better writer?
That's always the hardest question. My favorite writers are Willa Cather and Thomas Hardy. I don't know if any of you have read either of them, but if you haven't, I can't recommend enough that you read My Antonia by Willa Cather. It's one of the most beautiful books ever. And Thomas Hardy, I love all of his books. Alice Walker, The Color Purple is one of my favorite books. It changed my life. Anything by Marilyn Robinson really changed my life. Gilead, Housekeeping, Lila, Home, all of her books. Zora Neale Hurston, I love Their Eyes Were Watching God. And even more so, I love her lesser-known book, Jonah's Gourd Vine, which my new novel is sort of an homage to. I read everything, every kind of literature. People tend to think that I mostly read Appalachian literature, but that's probably the least thing that I read, actually. I love British literature and American literature, especially. I'm minored in American literature, so I love it a lot. I just read anything I can get my hands on, you know, and I read fiction and nonfiction. I read a lot of poetry. It took me a long time to come to poetry. I was like in my 30s before I got poetry, and now it really has a huge influence on my writing. I think of music as literature too, and I really, music is a major influence on my writing, and so is cinema. When I'm really trying to write, I watch a lot of movies, I listen to a lot of music, I look at a lot of paintings, photographs. I use every kind of art that I can to help my writing. So any writers out there, that's another tip, I think.
Yeah, and going off of writing, I have students. I teach high school, and a lot of my kids are here tonight. And when I assign them a writing piece, a lot of them just groan. They hate writing. I think when I ask them at the beginning of starting a new task, how many of you guys hate to write? Probably 90% of their hands go up. And that makes me so sad. So what advice and encouragement would you give to young people who are writing about anything?
Well, I think the main thing is that if you can allow them to write about what they love, you know, then that helps a little bit. Because everybody likes to talk about what they care about. I think one reason they hate to write is because they have to do it their entire school career. You know, it's like the main way that we have of communicating and educating. So there's that attack. It's hard to not connect it to like an assignment, or we don't think of it creatively enough, you know. So if if people can just think of it more as an act of catharsis and creativity and writing about what they care about or telling their story, that helps some, I think. I don't think students dislike writing any more now than they did when I was young or reading. In fact, I think students that I come into contact with are actually better readers than we were, like more used to reading more. And I think things like Harry Potter and books like that are responsible for that. I mean, you know, when my daughters were growing up, there were book crazes. That didn't happen when I was a child. Like, you know, there was that awful Twilight phase that I had to live through and take them to the midnight book releases. And then the Harry Potter, which was, I thought was great. And lots of others that I can't think of right now. But, so I love that. That's sort of a cultural thing in a way it wasn't when I was growing up. But luckily, I have to get a plug in here because I have 3 of my teachers, former teachers, are here. And my 7th grade teacher was Sandra Stidham. She's sitting right here. And everywhere I go, I tell people that she is one of the main reasons that I'm a writer. When I was in 7th grade, she brought a table in and she put her own books on it, paperback books. And some of the books that became so instrumental to me were because she brought them in. Books like To Kill a Mockingbird, The Outsiders, Jubilee by Margaret Walker was another one that I remember. The Light in the Forest by Conrad Richter. Lord, that book's so great. And not only did she bring the books in, but she also encouraged me to be a writer and made me feel like that it was something, you know, really good to do with my life. And I loved the way how excited she got when she talked about literature. And then Miss Scoville's here. She was my high school English teacher. And again, just that love of literature and loving the written word and unashamedly sharing that with a room full of high schoolers. That's bravery, you know. And then my science teacher, Miss Stivers, is somewhere in the audience. I can't see anything back there. And I think I had you in high school and in college, right? Yeah, because you went to Sue Bennett later. And just, you know, there are 3 teachers that just have always stuck with me and were such good teachers and cared so much about their students and the written word and really giving us that knowledge. And you know, when you're from Kentucky and you go out into the world, people always say, oh, it's a shame about your education system. I had great teachers, and I always tell people that. You know, I had really, really devoted teachers who really changed my life. And so I always want people to know about that, especially because I'm from Kentucky, you know.
What are you working on now? And when shall we expect another book?
I'm working on lots of stuff right now. My new book is done, but it won't be out till 2018, spring of 18. It's called Little Fire. It's about a man who kidnaps his son, and they run off to Key West, Florida. I always wanted to write a book about people on the run, like people on the run from the law. That was a lot of fun. And so it's about parenthood. My children are now 21 and 18, and so I felt like I had enough expertise to finally write a book about being a parent and the complexities of that and the uncertainty of being a parent and the way that it never ends. And the great joy of that. So, yep, that'll be out in 18. I'm working on a new novel now that's set in Ireland, and it's about I always wanted to write a book about a boy and a dog because I've always loved dogs so much. And so right now it's called Boy and Dog. I don't know. I love that title, but some people don't. But and it's set about a year in the future, and Americans are now refugees trying to get into another country. And so dogs have been outlawed, and this boy's hiding this dog So I'm really having fun writing that. I'm also writing a book about Willa Cather, my favorite writer. There's a series of writers writing about writers, and I've been asked to write a book about her. And the biggest task that I have on my plate is I have been commissioned to write a musical for a London, England theater company. And I have no idea how to do that, so I'm trying to figure out how. But I'm not going to say no. I'm going to try it and see what happens. I usually work on 4 or 5 things at once because I always think of it as like a stove with 4 pots on it, and one's boiling harder than the other one, and so I'm going to the one that's boiling the best at the time.
Yeah.
And I always have something else to go to. And I never have writer's block that way because I'm able to move around that stove top.
Well, I think at this time we will open this up to audience questions, if you're good with that. So if anybody has any questions and you'd like to step up to the microphone or stand up at your seat like Peggy said, we're going to open it up to you guys. Everybody's so shy tonight. Oh, we've got a question over here.
You mentioned doing research for Eli the Good with the Vietnam veterans and going to the therapists and stuff. What kind of research did you do for your new book where the man is on the run?
Sorry. Well, I had to do a lot of research about Key West, Florida, because, I'm from Eastern Kentucky, and I'm sort of just like the character's sort of just like me because he hasn't been there either, but I still needed to know everything I could about Key West. In the book, he lives there about 3 months. And so I was able to live there about a little more than a month in increments. I got a grant to go there, and they gave me a house and everything to ride in. And so I got to know the island really well that way. Also, my lead character is a preacher, and so I grew up in a pretty strict holiness church, so I understood that. But then I still talked to a lot of preachers. And then the Episcopal Church becomes important in the book. So one of my best friends is an Episcopal priest. I interviewed him a lot. I interview people a lot, and I go to places. I read everything I can. While I was writing the book, I took a subscription to the Key West newspaper. So, it was a weekly subscription. So every week I would know everything going on in the town. And it's set, and even though I wrote it in 2015, during the editing process, I updated it and made it be set in 2016, so it's very contemporary. So I had to be real familiar with everything that was going on and all that. I used to hate research, and now I really love it. It's a fun part of the process.
Kind of uncovering things.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have any other questions?
Well, my brother was in Vietnam, and he suffered from post-traumatic stress. But Eli the Good, I hate to tell you, you may be from Eastern Kentucky, but that's the way it was in '54 in Louisville, Kentucky, riding my bike down the road and the sun shining. And I'll never forget the day, I'm not sure whether it's 52 or 54, that the Korean War ended. And everybody was celebrating. But when my brother came back from Vietnam, he was a corpsman. And unbeknownst to me, they didn't talk about it. And I asked him, did you shoot anybody? He said he wouldn't answer me. And he never, until just recently, got to talking with fellow Vietnamese people that had been there.
Right.
And they had a gathering in Indiana, Kokomo, and they had to quit firing off the cannon because it brought the PS back.
Well, I'm glad you phrased that the way you did, because it reminds me that, in my mind, this book is set in Lilly, Kentucky, and I'm guessing most of you know Lilly. And then in the book, they go to the town is called Refuge, but Refuge in my mind is actually Corbin. And so this is the only one of my books that I think of as being Corbin. And my first three books are sort of a combination of London, Manchester, and Haydn. But this book is Corbin, Kentucky, and Lilly, Kentucky. But I didn't want to specify where it was because I wanted it to be a book that any American could relate to, and so I didn't get very specific with the place details. I wanted it to be anybody who grew up in a place that had rural people in it, and that they would be able to relate to it.
You have any other questions?
How much did Ernest Hemingway influence the Key West?
Good question, because, I had only read one Hemingway, and I'm not a huge fan of Hemingway. He's a little bit of a minimalist for me. I like a lot more writing. But I read To Have and Have Not, which is set in Key West, and then I read The Old Man and the Sea, because one of my characters in the book is reading The Old Man and the Sea. And so he had a big influence on the new book. Not, in the language, but in the feel of the place. And the characters are living just down the street from Ernest Hemingway's house and all that. Good question. Anybody else?
One of my favorite things about Eli, the character, is his connection with nature. I mean, his tree and the fox that's not there but he thinks is there. What did you intend to reveal about Eli through that connection?
Well, he's just he's a very sensitive child. And in fact, I didn't know this when I was writing the book, but a therapist friend of mine tells me that Eli actually has a diagnosis that I didn't know about. There's a thing called sensitive child syndrome, and he has a pretty light case of it. But I mean, he hates walking across the yard because he's afraid of. He hates to think of the ants that he's killing and things like that. And some children, people who really suffer from sensitive child syndrome, they actually can't walk across the grass because they're afraid of what they're killing and what they're hurting. They can't cut the grass and things like that. Often when you write a book, people will write to you and diagnose your characters that way, which is always fun. And I think in that case it was true. But I think one thing I was doing was I think I'm saddened by how much more in touch with nature my generation was than the generation after that. And I don't say that in any way to criticize them or to make them feel bad. It's not their fault. It's my generation's fault, largely. And the culture's fault, because we can't turn people loose the way we feel like we can't turn them loose the way we used to. And so as a parent, I was always real conscious that, every Sunday I would make sure that we were at a state park or something like that. But at the same time, that's not the same when you're out in a state park as being turned loose in your woods, that you can come out one side of the woods and you can go to your neighbor's house and get a cup of Kool-Aid and sit and visit or whatever. It's just different. And I mean, for me, nature has always just been a real comfort and something that that's where I feel the best. There's when I'm on a lake bank, it's when I'm the happiest. I mean, I love the beach too, but I would rather be on the lake bank because there's woods right there and there's the water, and that feels like home to me. And I've just always had a connection with trees. That every one of my books have trees as central motifs in them. I wrote a book called A Parchment of Leaves, and the central symbol in that book is a redbud tree, which symbolizes this woman's home and her family and everything. That would be the other major tree in my writing. But I'm really glad they put the beech tree on the cover. I wanted the fox on the cover, but the marketing people said that women and girls wouldn't read a book with fox on the cover, so they're a little limited on the way they think about gender. But I've always loved foxes too, so that's just sort of a, and also that works as a really good symbol because as I understand it, I may be wrong about this, but I think a fox goes from childhood to full adulthood over the course of one summer, so that was sort of symbolic of Eli. I mean, he's only 10 years old, but he's, gaining real knowledge, so he's obviously not becoming an adult, but he's gaining some adult knowledge. Are we out of time?
We've got a few more minutes
Okay.
for a few more questions if anybody
I'll
else
talk
has
as long as y'all
a
want to.
question.
This is not a question, but I just have to ask you in a way, do you have any idea how much I am busted in progress?
Well, thank you. I'm proud that you're here.
That might be better than a question.
Yeah.
I think.
Anybody else?
If I might touch on a parchment of leaves.
Sure.
Would you ever revisit maybe Luke and Bertie's story? I know it ends tragically, but I've always wanted to know their life,
Me
their
too.
story together.
Yeah. I would love to. I've thought about that. Yeah. My problem is I have too many ideas and not enough time to do them all. I'm working on this boy and dog novel, and then I know what my next novel after that, I know what I want it to be about. But I would love to return to Luke and Bertie. I also want to write I've always had in my mind a Christmas story that's sort of a sequel to Clay's Quilt. And so it would be like a short book that I'm going to try to write eventually. But on one hand, you're always a little bit scared to revisit characters like that because I sort of got them to where I wanted them to be, and I hate to mess with their lives. But in Luke and Bertie's case, like you said, it all ends so tragically that it would be great to go back and see, some of the joy in their lives before it ends tragically. Thank you. You might have given me the nudge to do that. Parchment is the book that people write to me the most about, and the book that I think is the most special to me. It's the book that I had the best experience writing. That book I feel like it was really given to me. It just came to me, and I didn't have to strive for it the way I have most books. I wrote it in about a year, whereas most of my books have taken me 4 or 5 years to write. Any other questions about any other of the books? Or anything else?
Something else? I believe if I had the chance again, I would be a student at Berea. How do you feel about Berea?
It's a really good place to teach, and I'm really lucky because I only teach 3 classes a year, and so I'm usually working with upper class students, seniors, juniors and seniors, who really have a handle on who they are by that time. And I'm working with a lot of creative writers, and I'm working with students from the region, mostly, and I love that I'm getting to work with students from the region. I have a lot of students that come to me and confide in me at Berea about worrying about their dialect, worrying about where they're from, things like that, because suddenly they're thrust into this world where there's a lot of diversity and a lot of people from all over the place, even though most of them are from the region. And so I'm really glad that I can be there to talk to them and that they have a professor who talks like them, because not a lot of professors at Berea are from the region. I don't mean to put people down who aren't from the region, but I think it means something for the students to hear somebody talking the way they talk. And it is it is a problem, that dialect prejudice really happens in colleges, for sure. Anybody else?
Throughout your entire writing career, what character have you been able to relate the most to and enjoyed the most writing about?
Well, I guess every time I wrote a book, it was whatever book I was working on. When I wrote Clay's Quilt, I was Clay Sizemore, if any of you have read that. And Then when I was writing Eli the Good, I guess I was more like Nell than anybody else. I was like, as a child I was Eli, and as an adult I was like Nell. And in Parchment of Leaves, I think I enjoyed that so much because I wasn't really like anybody in the book, and so I was living pretty vicariously through them. And like you have these scenes of these men riding horses, and and almost like a Western sort of thing. I love Westerns. So I loved writing that book because I'm living vicariously. I loved writing The Cold Tattoo because it's a lot about music and the paradox between people who are very religious and people who are not religious at all, living alongside each other and trying to find common ground. I loved exploring all that because that's sort of like what living in southeastern Kentucky is like, period. So every book had its own kind of things I loved. I mean, I guess if I had to say what character I identified more than any character, it would be the character in my latest book that's not out yet, Little Fire, the character of Asher Sharp, the preacher, who is going through all these huge changes in his life and just trying to figure it all out. Really, that's what each book's about, because you never stop figuring it out.
Right.
Anybody else?
What region would you say that Parchment of Leaves is located in?
Well, that's definitely in my mind set in Leslie County, Kentucky. So that's sort of between Manchester and Hazard. There's an area out on this side of the town of Hyden called Rock House, Buffalo Mountain, that area. That's where that's at. How many of you have roots in Leslie County? Yeah, a lot of people in Laurel County do. And so I spent a lot of my childhood in Leslie County, spent my summers in Leslie County. We went back and forth to Leslie County all the time. It's where my mother was from. And until pretty recently, like the last 5 or 6 years, had a lot of family. Well, about the last 10 years, had a lot of family there. Now almost all of them have moved to Corbin or London. There's just, not a lot of economy in Leslie County. So I can take you right to the place in Leslie County that Parchment Leaves is set there for sure.
I think that's about all the time that
Okay.
we've got. But Silas will stick around for a little while.
I'll be
I think
right
he's
back
gonna,
there
he's gonna, be
somewhere?
back here
Okay.
signing some books. I want to thank everybody for coming. I think Peggy's got something that she wants to say.
Well, first of all, I want to thank our panel, Christina, Megan, and Leah, and of course Silas.
Yes.
I think they did a great job. Let's give them a hand.
Thank y'all.
Most of all, though, I want to thank you all for coming out. We have a great audience here tonight, and we really appreciate the support that you give to programs like this. We love putting these programs on because we love seeing how much the community comes out and supports them. So please continue to keep on doing that for us, and we'll keep on giving you programs. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight, and a special thanks again to Silas. Don't forget to go to Berea and see him on October 27th, too. Thank you so much, Silas.
Thank you.
Thank you.